Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we completed the excellent Turtle Rock, giving us the final crystal. That leaves us with only one final dungeon to complete. We're into the end game now. All that's left is Ganon's Tower. As far as pre-dungeon stuff to do goes, well, there isn't any. Ganon's Tower is pretty much right beside Turtle Rock, only a few screens over, so it's simply a matter of walking over there. However, this is a good time to round up any collectibles, such as heart pieces that you're missing, if you feel so inclined. I also recommend nabbing yourself the silver arrows and final sword upgrade if you haven't yet. It isn't required for the dungeon, but you will need it for the final boss fight. There is an opportunity between the dungeon and your showdown with Ganon to grab it if you'd rather not take the detour yet, so it is not required per se, but the extra firepower does really come in handy here. And that's about it for pre-dungeon stuff this time. So the maidens and Zelda will use their power to dispel this barrier, and for the final time in A Link to the Past, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Ganon's Tower, our final dungeon in A Link to the Past. There's a lot going on in this place. It is easily the longest and most difficult dungeon in the entire game, as it should be. This is the finale, so it should be putting all of our skills to the test. Not unfairly. It is challenging in a reasonable way that respects the idea that maybe you've gotten better at this game since you started. In some ways, it reminds me of Spectacle Rock in Zelda 1, but far less of a slog to get through. Put less politely, this is what Spectacle Rock could have been if it were actually fun. The dungeon is massive too, a whopping 8 floors, though the bulk of the dungeon is concentrated on the first floor, which is a winding, twisting, interconnected pile of confusion. There's 25 rooms here, many of them being quite large, and with branching paths, loops, teleport paths, and multiple routes. As for upstairs, it's a linear, straight path up towards the boss fight, but they block off access to most of it initially, with the big key door ushering us downstairs first, so we'll come back to that later on. There's no one set path on floor 1. Instead, it's that sort of raw, open exploration that I love so much, but without a central room to memorably tie it all together. But you know what? I am totally okay with that. I've been critical of other dungeons lacking that in the past, since it tends to add a sense of cohesion to the exploration, but I would argue that it works here so well due to the trial by fire feeling that we find ourselves enduring here. Yes, it's a big winding maze, but it's also meant to keep you constantly moving. The objective here is to find our way to this room so that we can drop down to basement 1 and get ourselves the big key, which in turn will give us the dungeon item, as you'd expect, and unlock access to everything upstairs. Sounds simple enough, but finding your way there is a real task if you don't know where you're going, just due to how large and cryptic this place is. But with enough perseverance, you should be able to get there. It just may take you a bit. Again, in many ways, it resembles level 9 in Zelda 1, especially when you factor in the sheer abundance of teleport paths down here, sort of like level 9's underground passageways. In other dungeons, I'm not really that fond of these, since I feel like it muddles the sense of navigation and makes it harder to accurately draw a mental map of this place. And given the huge quantity of them here, you'd think I would be complaining. However, what this place does with them is notably different from what places like the Palace of Darkness did. Rather than building them into the navigation overall, the teleport pads are really isolated to being essentially a puzzle mechanic. They don't connect any rooms outside of the puzzles that they make up. So you'll go through 10 in a row to push through this little puzzle, but then outside of that, you won't really find them. And they don't factor into the progression outside of that scenario. I don't love puzzles that are just entirely trial and error like that, but it also isn't an outright sin or something that's annoying enough for me to really dock points. Speaking of those puzzle ideas, something this place notably does is intentionally not introduce new dungeon mechanics, instead throwing in and repurposing just about every puzzle mechanic introduced to us in previous dungeons, and testing us on our skills. The one exception to this is the invisible bridges, which did not feature in any prior dungeon. However, there is a single one of these bridges in a cave on Death Mountain, out in the overworld, so even that idea isn't wholly original here. So this acts as a sort of review of the adventure up until this point. The game has laid out the foundation already, and it's up to you to recall what you've learned during the game and apply those learnings here. Some may bemoan this, but if you ask me, this is exactly what a final dungeon should do. This is the final exam. Take your teachings and push your players to their limits without being too frustrating. That's probably the reason the dungeon item here is simply the red mail, another defense upgrade. Rather than introduce new ideas, it can double your defense yet again, and focus on those remixed puzzles and boss fights. Yes, boss fights. In addition to a lot of returning puzzle ideas, the dungeon includes rematches with the first 3 dungeon bosses, which were previously fought in the Light World. They are all much easier to defeat now. The Armos Knights are down in Basement 1 and reward us with that big key, and then the Lanmolas and Moldworm are upstairs, acting as barriers during our ascent up towards the actual boss. Lots of Zelda games feature boss rematches. Wind Waker most shamelessly in its own Ganon's Tower, but I think it's done best here, since they don't strip you of any weapons or anything of that nature. Instead, you go toe-to-toe with bosses that previously may have given you a hard time, and now you get to absolutely trounce them. If you've gotten all the sword upgrades, silver arrows, hearts, etc., you can utterly demolish these guys in mere seconds. It's one of the game's clever ways of subtly showing us how much stronger we've gotten during our adventure, and it is frankly super satisfying. After finding the big key, we head upstairs towards the boss, but getting there will be a challenge. This section is a long, linear path taking us farther and farther up the tower. Actually, not unlike the Tower of Hera, which occupies the same space in the Light World, though this place concerns itself a little less with fitting physically in the confines of a tower than that dungeon did. Regardless, this section of the dungeon is less about exploring and navigating a huge area like downstairs, and instead more focused on interesting combat scenarios, maybe as a callback to the upstairs section of Hyrule Castle, which also culminated in our battle against Ganon. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of level design in broad strokes, but as far as progression goes, each room is going to make you work for it. And while you could chalk this up to just a gauntlet of rooms with enemies, then more rooms with enemies, and etc., I genuinely feel they do a good job of making each room interesting here. You're not just fighting Wizrobes, but Wizrobes on treadmills and invisible bridges, Moblins on collapsing walkways, or Zazaks on ice floors with spike traps and Beamos. They're going to throw everything at you here. It's great, a real challenge, but never overwhelmingly so. Even those aforementioned boss rematches get a bit of a shake-up too, whether it be added projectiles or a different arena. This isn't to say that there are no puzzles in this section. There are, just as there are downstairs, but they limit them to individual room puzzles, like requiring you to light torches to open the door, rather than those expansive multi-room navigational puzzles found downstairs. So the pacing always feels like it's driving you onwards. Genuinely, the dungeon remains exciting right up until the very end. So after climbing up the tower to the very top, we can finally confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss chamber, we'll be greeted by the ever-joyful Ganon. Remember how I said this dungeon doesn't do much in the way of introducing new mechanics? Well, that goes for this boss as well, which itself is a rematch. The battle against Ganon plays out the same as before. The classic dead man's volley. Simply deflect these energy balls back at him with the Master Sword and avoid his other attacks. This iteration of the battle will be more challenging than the first time we faced him, as he'll create a pair of clones to attack you as well. Though they're not too hard to manage overall. You won't be able to defeat the clones, but you can deflect their attacks back to the real Ganon to deal some additional damage. People roll their eyes at me when I talk about Dead Man's Volley and loving this battle mechanic in Zelda games, but Ganon really was the first instance of it in the series, and well, to be honest, I really never get tired of it. It requires a level of timing and precision, and puts you squarely in the defensive position. Plus, there's always something satisfying about turning an enemy's attack back on them. Aside from that, Ganon should go down quickly enough. Perhaps too quickly if this were the end, but it is not. Once he's defeated, we'll see the spirit of Ganon rise up. Ganon here was not the big bad. He was merely a bunshin of Ganon's. The Demon King will flee from the scene, with the hero in pursuit, leading us to the top of the Pyramid of Power. The same spot we found ourselves standing after the last time we fought Ganon, in fact. The game offers you a bit of breathing room here. If you need to gather any resources such as potions or whatnot, now is the time. Or, if you haven't yet gotten those silver arrows, do it now. Otherwise, we can drop inside and confront the true final boss of the game. This battle is awesome! Oh, but first, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the music. It's great. There's this constant, almost militant beat to keep up the energy, dramatic, droning brass, and this constant sense of rising and falling tension. It's a brilliant piece for a boss fight, and leagues better than the usual boss theme. Fares pretty well on original hardware, but later games would iterate on this piece, re-recording it with proper live instruments, which only shows just how strong that original composition is. It's a great climactic piece that fits the game's finale to a T. Alright, on to the actual battle. Ganon attacks with a great variety of moves, all centered around these fire bats and his trident. He breaks the stage, permanently altering it for the rest of the fight, and even has two phases. Phase 2 also has him turn invisible, forcing us to light these torches in order to even see him. This opens up the opportunity to attack and use silver arrows. All the time, he's zipping around and relentlessly firing back at you. You have to be on the ball constantly, avoiding his moves, monitoring your own health and magic, and waiting for the right opportunities to strike back. Mind your footing too, as slipping off the stage will send you to the room below, forcing you to leave and restart the battle. So you have to keep track of your positioning to make sure you stay in the fight. I love this battle. In many ways, it feels like it recontextualizes and fixes the issues I had with the Ganon battle in Zelda 1. He still turns invisible and teleports around the stage, but rather than having to stab around blindly and just hope you land a hit on him, instead they turn this into almost a mini puzzle within the battle itself, making use of our inventory. It's great, and even after all of these years of me playing and replaying this game, I still have to bring fairies into this fight with me. This Ganon battle is among the best of the best in this series. I wholeheartedly believe that. It is a mechanically sound fight that ends the game with a bang. It is truly fantastic. After destroying Ganon, we get a moment of just silence, with light shining into the room from this newly opened doorway. Inside, we'll find the Triforce, and after listening to its essence speak to us, we can make a wish. A simple wish to undo the damage inflicted upon Hyrule. Thus, our adventure comes to a close. Credits roll, and we get to see Hyrule at peace once more. And that is until everything just inevitably gets messed up again in the next game. So that's the dungeon, and the end of A Link to the Past. Overall, Ganon's Tower serves as a great finale to the game. It reviews everything we've learned up until now and puts it all to the test, making victory feel earned. The rematches found here show how much stronger we've become, as those previously hard bosses can be killed in 1 or 2 hits, depending on how many sword upgrades you've managed to nab for yourself. The overall dungeon structure feels like the 2 sections of Hyrule Castle combined into one dungeon, rather than played separately, with the first section being a big, exploratory, winding mess of rooms that we have to comb through, and the second being a linear gauntlet. This, of course, has been the structure that most dungeons in the game have followed, but it's arguably done best here. The dungeon will challenge and push you in the best way possible, though at times it does feel a little too unforgiving, not so much in terms of the combat, but rather in terms of how many doors seal behind you, meaning if you miss certain things, such as the map in my case, there'll be a lot of retreading to get it. I don't mind having so many rooms loop back and connect in on each other. I think that is great, but it sucks to realize that I missed something after I've chosen one of 2 paths at a fork in the road. Simply letting me walk back the way I just came would alleviate this, rather than having to recomplete puzzles and take a second lap through large sections of the dungeon that I've already completed. Because of that, sometimes there is a little too much trial and error in that navigation on floor 1, especially when you factor in these teleport pad puzzles. But overall, it isn't anything that is a deal breaker, just a minor inconvenience here and there. Still, the dungeon is well balanced. Even though the challenges are genuinely a challenge, the dungeon offers you lots of resources and spots to breathe and refill hearts and magic. This includes multiple secret rooms with fairies to bottle, and even an opportunity to leave and restock on supplies before confronting Ganon. It does this by way of moving that Ganon fight to outside of the dungeon, so when that opportunity to stock up presents itself, it feels organic, as opposed to, say, I don't know, Fi outright telling me to go stock up on potions before the final boss fight. Thanks for that. So that's the end. You know, sometimes I think I mentally put this game up on a pedestal, but then I play it again, and it only reaffirms to me just how good of a game it is, how much of a marked improvement over the last 2 games this is. It's really a testament to its quality design here, how in only the 3rd installment in the series, so many ideas would get solidified, whether it be strong musical compositions, or dungeon items, or bosses who would reappear in some shape or form later on. This game oozes influence that is felt in pretty much every Zelda game to come after. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I hold a great deal of nostalgia for this game, but I genuinely adore it in a way that feels like the game earned it. So, it is a little bittersweet to write the end of this script. That is the end of dungeon design in A Link to the Past. But don't worry, dungeon design in Zelda will return soon. There's still plenty more 2D games to examine, and of course, the dungeons of Tears of the Kingdom await. I'd like to thank you all for watching this video and hopefully this little series. Extra special thanks goes to my channel members here on YouTube and my supporters on Patreon. You guys guys make this all possible, as well as keep me extremely motivated. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, and all of the other names that you're seeing on screen here right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.